Knight f3, King's Indian attack, opening line. With the King's Indian opening, White retains the option of various second pawn moves. However, Black is allowed to develop at leisure. Knight f6, King's Indian attack, symmetrical variation, opening line. It is simply not possible to evaluate this position. It is like a blank piece of paper, yet to be written upon. The game may evolve in too many ways at this point to formulate an evaluation. It is easier to list what openings are ruled out as a result of these moves than deal with the possibilities still remaining. d4, King's Indian attack, symmetrical variation, opening line. Flexible, with transposition into almost any queen-pawn opening still possible. g6, Indian defense, Tory attack, pseudo-King's Indian, opening line. This is one of several common ways to enter the King's Indian defense posture for Black. Yet to be decided are the related defenses, the Yugoslav variation, levering the center with c5, or Benoni defense, or Grunfeld defense. Knight b d2, out of opening book. c4 would have been in the Indian defense transposed book opening. d5, b4. Bishop g7 clears the way for a kingside castle. e3. Castle kingside. Bishop e2 enables the short castle. c6. Castle kingside. a5 attacks White's pawn at b4. b5 moves it out of immediate danger. c5. c3. Knight b d7 removes the threat on Black's pawn at c5. a4. b6. Bishop a3. Bishop b7. c4. Rook c8. Rook c1. Rook e8. C takes d5. Knight takes d5. Blocks White's pawn at d4. D takes c5. Knight takes c5. Bishop takes c5. B takes c5. Creates a passed pawn on c5. Black wins a bishop and 2 pawns for a knight and 2 pawns. Material. Queen b3. Knight b6 blocks White's pawn at b5. Rook f d1. Queen c7. Knight c4 attacks Black's pawn at a5 and blocks Black's pawn at c5. Bishop d5 pins White's knight at c4. Knight f d2. Rook e d8. Queen c2 frees White's knight at c4 from the pin. e6. Knight takes a5. Creates a passed pawn on a4. White wins a pawn. Rook a8. Attacks White's knight at a5. Knight d c4. Protects White's knight at a5 and blocks Black's pawn at c5. Bishop takes c4. Attacks White's knight at a5. Knight takes c4. Blocks Black's pawn at c5. Knight takes a4. Isolates White's pawn at b5. Bishop f3. Threatens Black's rook at a8. Rook takes d1, check. Removes the threat on Black's rook at a8 and checks White's king. Rook takes d1. Protects White's king and threatens Black's rook at a8. Black wins a rook, a knight, and a pawn for a rook and a bishop. Material is even. Rook a7. Moves it to safety. Rook d6. Knight c3. Slightly better is Knight b2. Analyzing. The chessmaster recommends knight to b2. You move your knight to b2, which takes the knight away from the edge of the board. White responds by moving the pawn to b6, which forks your rook and your queen and advances the passed pawn. You move your rook to a1, which moves it to safety, protects your queen, and checks White's king. White counters with rook to d1, which protects White's king and forks your queen and your rook. Your rook takes rook, which protects your queen and checks White's king. White responds with bishop takes rook, which protects White's king and attacks your queen. You move your queen to d8, which moves it to safety. White responds with knight takes knight, which attacks your pawn at c5. Your bishop captures knight. White counters with pawn to b7, which moves it to safety and adds a promote threat at b7. You move your pawn to c4, which advances the passed pawn. White answers with pawn to f4. You move your queen to b6, which pins White's pawn at e3, removes the threat on your bishop and forks White's pawn at b7 and White's pawn at e3. White counters with the bishop to f3, which protects White's pawn at b7. You move your pawn to c3, which moves it out of immediate danger and pushes the passed pawn. White replies by moving the king to f2, which protects White's pawn at e3. As a result of this sequence of moves, you win a rook and a knight for a rook and a knight. Additionally, White's attack potential is greatly decreased. Also, the development of your pawns is somewhat improved. Lastly, the pressure on White's king is slightly increased. Knight c3. Slightly better is Knight b2. b6. Moves it out of immediate danger, forks Black's rook and Black's queen, and pushes the passed pawn. Rook a1. Check. moves it to safety, removes the threat on black's queen, and checks white's king. Rook d1 protects white's king and forks black's queen and black's rook. Knight takes d1, removes the threat on black's rook. B takes c7, adds a promote threat at c7. Knight takes e3 check, forks white's queen and white's king. Bishop d1 protects white's king and attacks black's knight with 2 pieces. Knight takes c2, threatens to mate, rook captures bishop, and attacks white's bishop. c8, queen, check, removes the threat on white's bishop and forks black's king and black's pawn at c5. White wins a queen for a rook and a pawn. Bishop f8. Forced, threatens mate, rook takes bishop, protects black's king and black's pawn at c5, and attacks white's bishop. Queen d8 protects white's bishop. King g7 frees black's bishop from the pin. h4. Knight d4 attacks white's bishop. Knight e3 removes the threat on white's bishop. Knight f5. Slightly better is king g8. h5. Knight takes e3. F takes e3. White wins a knight for a knight. Rook a6. Bishop b3. Rook d6 attacks white's queen. Queen g5 moves it to safety, pins black's pawn at g6, removes the threat on white's pawn at h5, attacks black's pawn at c5, and blocks black's pawn at g6. Rook d7 protects black's pawn at c5. Queen e5 check, checks black's king and blocks black's pawn at e6. King g8 moves it out of check. Bishop c4 blocks black's pawn at c5. Rook d1 check, checks white's king. King f2 moves it out of check. Rook c1 attacks white's bishop. Queen f4 protects white's bishop. King g7. g4 removes the threat on white's pawn at h5. Bishop e7 leads to h6, check, king g8, queen e5, bishop f8, bishop takes e6, rook c2, check, king f3, rook c1, bishop d5, rook d1, g5, rook c1, king e4, rook f1, which loses a pawn. Better is king g8, leading to g5, rook c2, check, king f3, g takes h5, queen e4, rook d2, bishop d3, bishop g7, queen takes h7, check, king f8, bishop e2, bishop b2, queen takes h5, which wins a pawn for 2 pawns. Queen e5, check, checks black's king and blocks black's pawn at e6. King g8. Slightly better is king h6. Thinking. The chess master recommends king to h6. You move your king to h6, which moves it out of check, attacks white's bishop, and blocks white's pawn at h5. White replies by moving bishop to e2, which moves it to safety. You move your rook to b1. White responds with pawn takes pawn, which attacks your pawn at f7 and isolates your pawn at h7. Your pawn at h7 takes pawn, which protects your pawn at f7. White responds by moving queen to h8, which checks your king. You are forced to move your king to g5, which moves it out of check and blocks white's pawn at g4. White responds with queen to e8, which forks your bishop and your pawn at f7. You move your bishop to f6, which moves it to safety. White responds with queen takes pawn at f7, which attacks your pawn at e6 and isolates your pawn at e6 and your pawn at g6. You move your pawn to e5, which moves it to safety. White counters by moving the queen to f8, which attacks your pawn at c5. You move your rook to c1, which protects your pawn at c5. As a result of this sequence of moves, the mobility of white's pieces is somewhat decreased. In addition, the development of white's pawns is somewhat weakened. King g8. Slightly better is king h6. Queen b8, check, leads to bishop f8, bishop e2, rook c2, queen b3, rook d2, queen c3, rook a2, e4, bishop e7, e5, h6, which does not result in any captures. Better is h6, leading to bishop f8, bishop takes e6, rook c2, check, king e1, rook c1, check, king d2, rook f1, bishop d5, c4, queen e8, rook f6, king c3, rook f2, king takes c4, which wins 2 pawns. White's only meaningful error of the game gave away a 1 position, but black ended up resigning anyway. King g7. Look out! Leads to queen b2, check, bishop f6, queen takes c1, g takes h5, g takes h5, king h6, bishop e2, bishop h4, check, king f1, bishop e7, e4, check, king g7, queen c3, check, f6, queen g3, check, king f7, h6, king e8, which wins a pawn for a rook and a pawn. Much better is bishop f8, leading to bishop e2, rook c2, queen b3, rook d2, queen c3, rook a2, e4, bishop e7, e5, h6, which results in no exchange of material. This was Black's key blunder. Black was never able to recover, and eventually resigned. Queen b2, check, removes the threat on White's bishop and forks Black's king and Black's rook. Black resigns.